If I can ask you all to mute yourselves, please. That will be fantastic. Except for John.
Yes, I'll remain unmuted. Okay.
And I'll do the same. All right, hand it over to you now, John.
Okay, going to share my screen again. I always get scared when I do this, so it's not going to work properly. Okay. Okay, last time I think I just finished by talking a little bit about why there's such a parallel between Imhotep and Joseph. And this is just a little bit of fun. I'm not too sure we should take it all that seriously, although it's a possibility. I don't know, but it's a possibility. But probably the second, I've got it sort of in two units. The second unit is probably much more probable explanation of why Joseph is not mentioned in Egyptian history. So I'm starting off by saying, why is it that Joseph isn't recorded in Egyptian history? The fact is that many great people beside the pharaohs were recorded. They had their own sarcophagus and they had their own little tombs and things. It wasn't just the pharaohs. But somebody who was influential as Joseph, and was certainly a powerful second-level ruler in Egypt, is interesting why there's absolutely no record of him. Or possibly there is. So the first one we're going to have a look at is the possible that Joseph and Imhotep were the same person. Said to you last time that there was a movie made called The Mummy, and I can remember it starred Brendan Fraser as the sort of soldier of fortune guy who was in the movie. I can't remember who the femme fatale was, but I'm sure there was one. And about this mummy that was discovered and came to life and made scarab beetles eat people and all sorts of stuff. And never in my life did I ever think that Imhotep would ever become connected to someone in the Bible. Imhotep was the name of this mummy that came back to life again. And when you look through your Google search, if you put in Imhotep and Joseph, you'll find stacks of people have written correspondences between the two of them. And indeed, there's a very strong correspondence between them. But a lot of it, I think, might be made up. But let's go ahead and we'll see what we find out. Okay, first of all, who was Imhotep? This is the guy who is the star of the Mummy movie. He was the actual dead Egyptian who was supposed to come back to life again. But he was the prime minister under King Joseph, about 2600 or so BC. And as soon as I say that, you'll look at it and say, the timing's wrong. He can't possibly have been the same as Joseph, because Joseph certainly didn't live at 2600 BC. But we're going to come back to that, and we're going to have a look at why that could be wrong. The records, he had quite an extensive record written about him. He was the head of the royal shipyards. He was the overseer of all the stone works in Egypt, all those great big blocks of stone that you see moved to make the pyramids. Imhotep was the person in charge of those. He was also in charge of building the tombs. Just going to move my tiles for a minute. He was also in charge of building projects and the tombs of the kings. In fact, the very first pyramids were made by, or planned at least by, Imhotep. The first pyramid was King Joseph's pyramid, and it was a step pyramid. It wasn't nice smooth sides like the normal ones we see in the Valley of the Kings, but it sort of went up in steps, and that was the most primitive type, and that was the first. He made them for kings, King Joseph and King Sekhemtet, or however you pronounce that. Just a small break in the story. Many years ago, when I think Paddy was about 14 and Michael was about 10, Merrin took them to Europe and went to Greece, and they had a look at all the ancient Greek statues and sites, the Acropolis and all the rest, and she also took them to Egypt. So they saw all these wonderful sites in Egypt, the Valley of the Kings and all those sort of things. And there was a very famous queen in Egypt, probably the only queen, not the later ones, people like about the time of the Greeks and the Romans, those ones, the situations were different. But there was a very famous queen who ruled, and her name was Hatshepsut. And the guy who was guiding my two little boys said, it's a really hard name to remember. And of course, everybody struggled, school kids struggled with trying to remember Hatshepsut. But he said, remember it like this: hat, cheap, suit. And it works. And it works. That's how I remember it. I still say in my brain, hat, cheap, suit, and out comes Hatshepsut. So, okay, I don't know how to pronounce this name. I'll see if I can get my little pointer working. Yeah, this name here, you can pronounce it yourselves. He was honoured by being mentioned on statues of the king. The King Joseph put down comments about his famous architect and all the good things he did. And he's in that necropolis at Saqqara. First architect ever mentioned in the history of Egypt. And he was also the high priest of the city of On. And you might think straight away, there's a connection, because we know that Joseph married into the priesthood. He married the daughter of the high priest. And so there's a bit of a connection there. But so far, it doesn't look like there's anything that's too much of a connection. Imhotep was chief architect of Pharaoh Joseph. He was responsible for the first known monumental stone buildings, the step pyramid at Saqqara, and the first architect that we ever have recorded his name. And this is the actual step pyramid. That's Joseph's pyramid, first pyramid ever built. And what you'll notice straight away, I hope, is it's a bit like the pyramids that were built in Babylon. Babylon had these pyramids that we know that they were small by comparison, but they were step pyramids. And there's a correspondence between them, and that might become significant later. Okay, Imhotep's influence lived on after his death. In the New Kingdom, he was venerated as a patron of all scribes, personifying wisdom and education. Later, he was described as the son of Ptah, chief god of Memphis, in recognition of his role as such a wise counsellor. This is the sort of thing that happens in Egyptian folklore. What happens is, as the centuries roll by, great people take on even greater significance when they suddenly become the son of a god. And here, the same thing has happened to Imhotep. He is now described as the son of one of the gods, and this sort of thing was sort of common. Didn't happen while they were alive. It happened later when all the stories got embellished.
Not be in Egypt's history.
Could we all mute, please?
Egypt's history.
Could we all mute? Could we all mute, please?
Egypt's history.
No, okay. Brenda, could you mute?
Sorry.
Mute. Okay, later he became a local god at Memphis, where he was glorified for his skills as a physician and a healer. He is said to have extracted medicine from plants and treated diseases, etc., like gout and arthritis. I reckon I could use someone like that, not for the gout, but for the arthritis. He was considered to be an intermediary between men and gods, etc., and it was believed that he had all sorts of powers, medical powers in particular. Okay, there's a picture. If you wonder what Imhotep looks like, he's in the Louvre. That's a statue of him. If he was Joseph, remember that he was so handsome that Potiphar's wife fell for him, and I'm not too sure she would have fallen for him if he looked like that. But anyway, that's a picture of what Imhotep was supposed to look like, and thank goodness the baddies that got into the Louvre the other day didn't go and steal him. Okay, now we come to the parallel. And the first thing is, the location of Imhotep's self-constructed tomb remains unknown, despite efforts to find it. He definitely had his own tomb. There is no question that in the writings on the wall of the Pharaoh, it was said that this great person, second in charge in Egypt, did have a tomb along with the pharaohs, but it's never been found. Why? Well, if he is Joseph, it's because Joseph, in fact, may have been laid to rest for about 300 or 400 years, but he was definitely taken back to the land of Canaan. Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, then you must carry my bones from this place. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. So that tells us that he did go through the Egyptian burial process. He was buried as an Egyptian, embalmed as an Egyptian, and could very well have been buried in the area of the Pharaoh, but no trace of him now. And then we go to Exodus, and it says that Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath. He had said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place. So it's quite possible that Imhotep was buried, but was dug up again, or hardly dug up, transported, and his grave dismantled because he was actually taken to Canaan with the Israelites. Okay. The parallel between the two of them. There's an ancient stone that was dug up which bears an inscription containing the legend about a famine of 7 years long during the reign of King Joseph. And as soon as you see there was a famine of 7 years, you obviously think of Joseph straight away. Imhotep is credited with having been instrumental in ending this famine. He explained the connection between the god Kun. Now that god, of course, is the Egyptian god, but Joseph certainly would have said that his God had explained the dreams of Pharaoh. So he got a connection between God and the rise of the Nile to the king, who then had a dream in which the Nile god spoke to him, promising an end to the drought. So there's a connection between the two of them. This is the actual stone that was dug up. And unfortunately, Carlton, if you're awake, I'm going to ask you to hold your space bar down and read the first line because, again, I can't read it. You're muted, Carlton. You're muted.
Okay.
Thank you.
At the top where it says the famine of Stella is an inscription written in Egyptian hieroglyphics located on Sheol Island in the Nile near Aswan in Egypt, which tells of a 7-year period of drought and famine during the reign of Pharaoh
Joseph, yeah.
Joseph.
That'll do, Carlton. Thanks, mate.
Okay.
That's the only bit I can't read. Okay, around about that period of the Third Dynasty. It is thought that this stele was inscribed during the Ptolemaic period, which ruled from 332 to 31 BC. The inscription has been tentatively dated to the reign of King Ptolemy in around about 205 BC. Couple of things. It describes in great detail the story very, very similar to Joseph's story, that there was this famine, a famine for 7 years, and a dream came. The dream had to be interpreted, and it was through that dream that the drought was broken and that everybody was able to live again. But there's lots more parallels as well. Now, hopefully you'll see straight away that there's a problem. And the problem is that this stele, I'm not familiar with that word. It's this word here, stele. It just means like an obelisk, a stone with writing on it. I don't even know how you pronounce it. But anyway, that represents this record, but it's written 2,000 years after the event. And I'm going to suggest to you, what would it be like if we tried to write a story of someone who lived 2,000 years ago? And I think probably the story's been embellished. As it's been passed down from word of mouth for 2,000 years, we've all heard of Chinese whispers, but I suggest that probably Egyptian whispers are just as much a cause for changing the story. The fact is that it remains very much a story that's parallel to Joseph. It's possible also that the story of Joseph was well known, but it's been conflated with the story of Joseph, and that the story of Joseph, in fact his architect, Imhotep, the two stories have been mixed over the last 2,000 years. So it's possible this story is deliberately imitating Joseph because of those, as I would say, Egyptian whispers. Okay, after Joseph or Imhotep's death, Other copies and wise sayings, they took credit for them. And these sayings passed down through several generations, and instead of being attributed to Imhotep, they are attributed to Pharaoh. Now, what this has done, they've made Imhotep into a god. Pharaoh is the voice of the Egyptian creator Pharaoh. And they've sort of mixed them up together. So thousands of years later, several papyri, I think it's papyri, isn't it, instead of papyruses, but anyway, have found which support the copies of the instruction of Pharaoh. And the rest of these manuscripts, the writer states that he is near death, having lived 110 years, and we all know Joseph lived 110 years, and that he received honours from the king exceeding those of his ancestors. In other words, he received the most honours ever given a man by Pharaoh, which corresponds to Joseph straight away. And we know that Joseph also died at 110, so that's another parallel. I got this off the web. I got this, it's a list that's published. There's lots of people talk about this. As I said, it's sort of good fun. But what I'll do is go through each one of the parallels between the two of them and you make of it what you will. Joseph was second in command under Pharaoh. Genesis 41 tells us that. Imhotep was second in command under Pharaoh Joseph. So there they are. They've both got exactly the same position. Joseph lived to an age of 110. Genesis 50. Imhotep lived to 110. Joseph was a great architect and builder, and so was Imhotep. And you might say, well, where do we get that from? I can't remember anything in the Joseph story that tells me that he was a great architect and builder, but there is a hint in the fact that he built storehouses to hold enough grain to feed the whole country for 7 years. That's got to be an enormous building or series of buildings. And I dare say that he was a great architect and builder. Just imagine trying to build a storehouse or series of storehouses to hold breakfast, lunch and dinner for a whole nation for 7 years. It must have been an enormous project, so I'll give it to whoever made this website, I'll give it to them that Joseph would have been a great builder. He stored up corn for 7 years, during the 7 years of plenty. Same for Imhotep, he stored up corn for the 7 years of plenty. 7 years of famine followed that, and that was predicted by a dream. 7 years of famine also followed in the time of Imhotep. Joseph was an interpreter of dreams, so was Imhotep. Imhotep was a builder of pyramids and palaces, and this website listed Joseph. I don't think Joseph ever built any pyramids or palaces, so I've got a little red question mark over that one. Joseph had his name changed. He became Savnath Paneah, which means the saviour of our age, and he had physicians as servants. Genesis 50 tells us that he had all these servant physicians. Imhotep was a physician. Joseph married into the priesthood of On, and the same thing with Imhotep, he married into the priesthood. Joseph was known for his knowledge of astrology, and that was the same for Imhotep. And you might say, well, where did Joseph ever do anything about astrology? Well, that was in his divining cup. Remember when they looked in the sack that belonged to the little boy, the youngest one? They found there was the divining cup that Joseph used, and that divining cup evidently indicates it was connected to astrology, and so same we go for Imhotep. Okay, educated man, both are educated, both are overseers of work, so there's the list. And as I said, there's a couple of reasons why we might think that in fact, rather than describing two separate people, over 2,000 years, it's very likely that the two stories got conflated. That the story of Joseph with his dreams and his second in charge of Egypt and all of the feeding of the people during a drought, that could have been mixed up with the story of Imhotep. So you can't guarantee that they're both two separate peoples with very, very parallel lives. And here's the next thing, which seems to be pretty difficult to try to get around. If you look at the time period, Imhotep lived around about 2005 or 600 BC. Joseph lived, well, a little shy of minus 2000 BC. So there's a big time difference. And you say, well, that means they can't possibly be the same person. Problem with that is that Egyptology is a very, very inexact science, and discoveries are made all the time which actually show that the timings that we used to believe in are no longer true. And this happened. Previous record, came from research from somebody called Dr. D. There's the name there. I guess she's some Egyptologist. Previous records suggested that pre-dynastic period, a time when early groups began to settle along the Nile and farm the land, began in 4000 BC. But new analysis revealed this process started later, maybe 3700 or 600 BC, or 3600 BC, yeah. This particular stone was inscribed with the names of early Egyptian kings. The team found that just a few hundred years later, by about 3100 BC, the society had transformed to one ruled by a king. Dr. D told the BBC World Service programme Science in Action that the time period is shorter than was previously thought, about 300 to 400 years shorter. So Egypt was in a state that emerged quickly over that time period with immense social change. So let's just see what that does to our little picture. Okay, if that time period was indeed much shorter, it would have brought the time for Imhotep back to just past 2000 BC and Joseph to just short of 2000 BC. So the period is much, much less. Still significant, but there's a way, you can almost see I'm trying to get around it. Give us a bit of belief in Imhotep and Joseph being the same. I don't think they were the same, but it's a bit of fun. When you take a measurement, any measurement, your measurement is never terribly exact. I mean, even if you said the distance from here to Brisbane is 1,000 kilometres, well, obviously it might be 1,010 kilometres or it might be 990 kilometres. You've just rounded it off to being the closest 1,000. And the same thing goes for these times. These times are very, very difficult to get exactly accurate. So what happens is when you make a measurement, you get what's called a normal distribution, or we'd call it a bell curve. And what this says is the chances of it being in the middle of your measurement is very, very high, but there is a slim chance that it was on one side of your measurement, or there's a slim chance it was on the other side. So when we have this measurement here, the most likely thing is that it's correct, but there's a slight chance that the bell curve takes us over there and a slight chance it takes it over here. Same with this measurement. This measurement is very difficult. If you ever try to figure out the ages of the patriarchs, it's always very, very difficult. Here's the most likely. The bell curve takes us to there and also over there, and you'll notice that the two bell curves cross at this point about there. So it's quite possible, small chance, maybe 1 or 2% chance, that they actually did occupy the same time. So there's the story of Imhotep and Joseph. I think it's a bit of fun. I sort of always like Egyptology. I reckon it would have been fun to be one of those guys that dig up stones and look for all these clues and all that sort of stuff, but very, very difficult to do. However, there is another possibility, and this one I firmly believe in. We can't prove that Joseph was Imhotep, but there's a second chance that can give us a clue as to what was going on at the time of Joseph, and it gives an explanation for a lot of weird verses that we read. Okay, so here's the next one, the next possibility. These are two of the weird verses. Genesis 43, they served him by himself, that's Joseph and his brothers, the brothers by themselves. Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, the Egyptians wouldn't mix with them, because Egyptians could not eat with Hebrews, because that is detestable to Egyptians. Why? Why is it that Egyptians hated to eat with Hebrews? I wouldn't have thought they even knew any Hebrews. But for some reason, they refused to eat together. Let's look at the next verse. Then Joseph said, I will go up and speak to Pharaoh and say to him, my brothers and my father's household have come to me. The men are shepherds. They tend livestock. They have brought along their flocks and herds and everything they own. When Pharaoh calls you in and asks, what is your occupation? You should answer, Your servants have tended livestock from their boyhood, just as our fathers did. Then you'll be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen. And by the way, Goshen is the best land in Egypt. It's in the Nile Delta. It's beautifully watered. It is absolutely the best farming land there is. Why would that happen? For all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. Why on earth would you tell the king of Egypt that you are shepherds, making sure he really understands it, because Egyptians hate shepherds? Wouldn't you think that would make the Pharaoh kick them out and send them to the worst land? No, that made him send them to the best land. And the reason is that Joseph came into Egypt at a very particular time in its history. It had actually had a soft takeover. There'd been a takeover by a really different group of people. And guess where they'd come from? They came from Canaan. There was a group of people which are called the Hyksos, and they've been called the shepherd kings in history. And the Hyksos come from the Canaanite states, where our group of Hebrews came from. And these Hyksos had came in about 1800 BC, and they had come in and they had taken over Egypt, but it was a soft takeover. I don't quite know how they did it, but they ended up actually getting the throne of Egypt. Doesn't seem to have been any battles. Maybe they did it by subterfuge, I don't know. But they were shepherds. They were exactly the same as the Hebrews were. They were Canaanites. And they had already come. When Joseph turned up, they were already in the land and they had taken the throne. They were the Pharaoh. So although the Egyptians hated shepherds, the Pharaoh didn't. The Pharaoh was in fact in charge of the Hyksos people, and this was the area where the Hyksos lived mainly. They mainly lived in the city of Avaris, and that's in the Nile Delta, and that's where Goshen is. Okay, so here's a bit of a timeline. The top there, I can't read that, I'm sorry, but don't worry about that. In around about 1765, Joseph is made Prime Minister. This probably said this is the first settlement of the Hyksos, about 2000 or something like that BC. Joseph is made Prime Minister. That's because the Pharaoh was a Hyksos. He was one of these shepherd kings. The second wave of Hyksos, after the first ones, came in, and that was the Israelites. They had title to all the land acquired by Pharaoh. They made the Egyptians slaves, and you remember in the story of in the story of Joseph, Joseph made the people buy the food. He had stored up the food for them, but he made them acquire the food by either buying it, and when they ran out of money, they had to give their land. They gave all their title of land to the shepherd king, to the Hyksos king, and then eventually they sold themselves, and the people, what the Bible says, is committed themselves to servitude to the king. So this is what was happening because there was this shepherd king or this Hyksos king. Okay, so there was a 20% tax on everything that was produced. The best land was allotted to the Hyksos. The best land, of course, was the land of Goshen. That was the land in the Nile Delta, and that was the bit that the people of, I was going to say Israel, they're not called Israel yet, they're called Hebrews. So the Hebrews were given that. About 1684, there's a third Hyksos invasion, this time probably from as far afield as the Babylonians. Set up their headquarters at Avaris. Remember, Avaris was that town right up in the Nile Delta. Retained the Hyksos, that is, they retained the same line of kings that were friendly to the Israelites, and so the Israelites were still being looked after. Then finally there was an Egyptian revolt in about 1536 BC. The Egyptians revolted, they drove out all the Babylonians and the Hyksos, and eventually they decided to enslave the remaining Hyksos, which we know were the Hebrews. So they were made into slaves, and eventually the Israelites fled the country via Moses. But we can understand, I've got a bit of sympathy for the Egyptians here, because Joseph had made them slaves and had taken all their land and enslaved them to the Hyksos, but now the Hyksos are defeated And of course the Egyptians now want to enslave these shepherd kings, etc. And so the poor old Hebrews are made slaves. And that all fits in. That fits in really, really well with the story. And there's these same verses again. I won't read them again, but these are the same verses that says the Egyptians won't eat with the Hebrews because they hate them, they're detestable. Egyptians find all the Hebrews detestable. Okay. Timeline. This time got nothing to do with old Imhotep. This time, this is the timeline of the Hyksos invasion. I use the word invasion fairly loosely. As far as I understand, it wasn't a warlike invasion. The Hyksos and these shepherd kings just seem to have come in and settled in Goshen and spread out from there. Don't know quite how they got to be Pharaoh of the land. But this is the period where the Hyksos reigned. It's exactly where Joseph came in. And no wonder he was greeted with very, very friendly behaviour by the king. They loved him because he was one of their shepherd people. And so that's how the story is set up. And I'm sure that was God's will because that was what sustained the people, the Hebrews, and how they were well looked after. Okay, this is just a verse to show that Joseph took all their land. They said, give us food that we might die, and so buy us food and their land, and we'll be in bondage to Pharaoh. So they took all their land and made them slaves. Okay, so then a new king arises, whom Joseph didn't know and meant nothing. And then came a new power to Egypt. This was about 1430 BC. This is when the Egyptians regained their power. This is when they became the kings. And so the new Pharaoh that arose and enslaved the Hebrews, that was the Egyptians again. So Egypt was again ruled by Egyptians. The memory of the hated Hyksos was wiped out. And again you can see if Joseph did have any statues or any significant history that was put down in the time when he was the ruler, it would have been wiped out. The Egyptians hated the very thought of the Hyksos, and they thought that the Hebrews were just another brand of Hyksos, and they would have eliminated every memory of Joseph. And so it's no wonder now when we look at the story that basically there's nothing left of that record. Okay. One of the great things about AI, I did ask AI, when did the Hyksos come in, just to make sure that was synonymous with Joseph, and it read 1.5 million documents for me and told me the answer in 1.5 seconds. The Hyksos were a mix of traders, immigrants, and possibly displaced nobility from the Levant. They were not initially perceived as a threat, and they gradually settled up there in the Nile Delta. Their main settlement was in the bustling port city of Avaris. So that just confirms that they were there. And finally, I asked AI, is it true that Joseph came into Egypt at the same time as the Hyksos were ruling? And AI confirmed it and said to me, yes, according to the biblical account, Joseph's story takes place during the period that the Hyksos ruled. The theory is supported by the details in the book of Genesis, such as the warm reception of the Asiatic Joseph by the Pharaoh, with some arguing that they were being made under the foreign-born Hyksos rulers who were the rulers of Egypt at the time. Book of Genesis suggests Joseph's rise to power was facilitated by a shared background with the Hyksos Pharaoh. And so we suddenly found that Joseph found a really friendly place to stay. When he was able to get to talk to the Pharaoh, he would have been very much liked, and the Pharaoh would have been disposed to look kindly towards him. Okay, now we do have a little bit of time. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to open up hopefully another PowerPoint if I can find it. Yeah, I can't see it. I did have another one here. Oh, I'm not going.
Did you open it up before you?
I don't think so, but look, I tell you what, we might give it a miss. I don't think I'll worry too much about it. We haven't got that much time. There's just a couple of things I'm going to say about Lot, and I might just leave it at just talking about Lot for the moment. There's a story of Lot which I think it's really important that we have a look at, because Lot takes on a really significant role in the New Testament. When we get to the New Testament, there are only two characters who represents the saints at the time when Jesus comes back. When Jesus returns, he says he's going to find a world that was similar to the world of Noah and similar to the world of Sodom and Gomorrah. Talked about this in the last two sessions, where we talked about what were the sins of those people, and we said the sins of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah were not the homosexuality, it was the fact that they neglected the poor. They just decided to just live life to the full. They decided to just build up businesses, buy better cars, buy better houses. That was their sin. And the same with the people in Noah's day. They also, Jesus said, all they did was just care about their day-to-day lives, giving no thought to God at all. But I didn't at that time stop to think about why Lot and Noah were chosen as the symbols of the righteous people of God. They were, both of them, taken as symbols of the saints when Jesus comes back to earth. Lot is a symbol of everybody who is righteous. And I just want to emphasise, look, there are things about Lot we all look at and say, oh, gee, I think he took the best land when he was asked to separate from Abraham. He looked to the Jordan Valley and said, oh, I'll take the best land, and that's pretty selfish. And certainly there were times when the men were beating at the door, he offered his two daughters. That's pretty hard to understand. But the fact is, he is given the most wonderful testimony in the second letter of Peter. We're told that Lot, his righteous soul, was vexed day by day by the unlawful deeds around him. That he was in anguish day by day by the evil, and Peter takes him as a symbol of the saints. He says at the end of that verse, or verses, God knows how to save the ungodly. I've heard it said, some people said, oh, well, maybe Lot was just relatively righteous compared to all the baddies around him. And maybe that he wasn't really righteous. And that's just silly. That's just silly. You can't be relatively righteous. You can't be half righteous. Righteous does not mean sinless. Righteous means forgiven. You're in a relationship with God. Lot was in a wonderful relationship with God. It's the most staggering relationship I could think of. Because Lot was the father of Jesus Christ. What better relationship can you have than that? Lot, of course, had, through his daughters, had a boy called Moab. Moab grew up and eventually had a little girl called Ruth. She eventually had a man called David, and he eventually became the great king that led to Jesus Christ. David, he was the one in the middle, but Lot was blessed with being the start of the line of Jesus Christ. He was wonderful. And I often look at my own life. What do I do in the morning? Maybe I go down for a coffee. I don't know. Talk to friends. Am I distressed every minute of my life by the evil that I see around me? Sometimes I am. But I don't think I'm feeling quite like Lot, that every day I'm distressed by the evil that I see around me. And Noah. Noah was the most righteous man on earth when the flood came. Well, maybe not. There was another man. There was a man called Enoch. And Enoch walked with God. And we're told that Enoch was translated, so he shouldn't see death. I believe the flood was local. I believe